So when we were last talking, we were talking about the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait and Clam Diggers by Willem de Kooning. Sorry, I had to run off. Had a bit of a family crisis to take care of. So the last thing we were saying was comparing these two in terms of value contrast. So we can say that the value of the de Kooning painting is overall light, dominated by lots of very, very light values, very pale yellows, very and white, and then but even the overall most average value of the painting is very much on the light side, very much lighter than a mid-gray. Um, Whereas the overall value of the Jan van Eyck is much closer to a value about like right about there, right? Kind of a mid to mid dark, um, and so between the two paintings, we can say that the Jan van Eyck has a wider value contrast because it has darks that are very, very dark, right? Darker than any of the darks here, but also a lot more of kind of mid darks all over the painting, and then it has just a few moments of very, very light values. And one of the things we can also note is that how that relates to composition. If we look at these two paintings and the way um, they kind of attract our attention, we have um, we have a painting that is overall kind of dark and dark mid, with a few areas like there, like there, like there, like there, a few areas that are light or dominated by lighter values, and where the objects feel like they're getting lots of light on them, and as well as the local value of the objects are quite light, and that those tend to be some of the most important focuses in the painting. And even when they're not one of the most important focuses in painting, right? Like let's say that hand or this window, they are still they're still areas because of that light value that do draw our attention. Not all of the focuses in the painting are created by that very light value and that value contrast. A good example of that would be this mirror in the back of the wall and the chandelier. Although they both have a relatively good amount of value contrast. Um, Whereas if we look at the de Kooning, the overall value of the painting is light. Much of it is quite light, um, and the areas that there's a lot of activity, and also the areas where we tend to have like things like a lot of figurative detail and specifically faces, also happen to be areas that have the most value contrast, especially the most darker values. So because of those are the areas that draw our attention. Um, so that would be another contrast. Um, in terms of color, one of the things that we could say about the color, the differences between the two paintings would be color organization. Um, if we look at the Arnolfini Wedding, it is overall like much of the color is kind of neutral, kind of dominated by browns and neutral grays. Um, but then, with the exception of this large amount of green, right? Slightly on the warm side of green, a little bit of her sleeve, right? And then the red of the bed, right? And you could make the case that it's almost triadic because of the sleeves, but I would say that the more dominant relationship here is a complementary relationship. It is really a painting that is all about kind of these brown neutral colors and then the strong interaction between the green to the red. And I think that her in the green dress and possibly pregnant, and that this is a wedding portrait, and then that paired with the red furniture, especially the red bed, is on purpose. Um, so then if you compare that to the color organization of Clam Diggers, we had a debate in class. Half of us felt one way, half of us felt the other way, as to whether you would think this is primarily a monochromatic painting or whether you would think of this primarily as analogous. The argument for monochromatic is that it is almost completely dominated by white and various values of yellow and yellow oranges. That's pretty much almost all the color in the painting. But some of the darkest values are browns that are either reddish browns or pure reds, like cadmium type reds, or greenish browns in a few places. And for those reasons, I would say that a better description of it would be analogous. Um, but it is important to recognize that, like, although it's analogous, it is dominated by one hue quite strongly. Um, Another thing that I think you could discuss in a comparison between them, and there would be a lot more that we could discuss. I mean, like, we could compare it in terms of line, um, but I think one of the things to discuss just in general is the difference between loose and gestural expression that we see in the de Kooning versus a much more tight and controlled execution, an organization of shapes and of line. And the loose gestural expression also therefore means that the marks and the shapes that the paint create, and as well as the lines, are much more overt and clear, you know, meaning that we see them clearly as separate things from the representation. You see this as a line as well as a contour of an arm, whereas the lines and shapes here in the Arnolfini Wedding are much more subservient to the representation and to the illusion of space, of form, and of light. Okay, as I said, there's way more we could discuss, but we need to move on. So on this comparison between the Raphael and the Delacroix, um, one of the main points I made in class was that both compositions are triangular based, right? But there's a strong difference between this Renaissance triangle, which is very, very kind of like carefully composed. It's slightly off center, but in a very kind of orderly way. The center of this triangle does not break the top of the canvas, and it feels very kind of symmetrical, even though it's off center, and it seems to imply a very kind of straight, upright type triangle, and it feels very stable and organized. Whereas the triangular organization of Delacroix's painting, right, the triangle kind of breaks the border in multiple places, but especially at the top, where it seems to imply going way above. It also feels like a very unequal, like that this diagonal is much, much more of a low-lying diagonal, and this is a much steeper diagonal on this side. The triangle is also off-centered, but in this case the off-centeredness seems more to, but partially because I think it's a horizontal composition, it creates a lot more movement and energy. This is a composition with a lot of activity. So another thing that we talked about was some of the color organization ideas, and the students in class pointed out, and I think rightly so, that one of the things that they're both doing in terms of composition is the use of blue and red, and specifically very similar kind of blue and red relationships, right? That the blue is a little bit darker and a little bit less intense. The red is warm on the warm side, just a little bit on the red-orange side, and a little bit lighter and significantly more intense than the blue, especially here on the Delacroix, right? That the blue really feels like less intense. It's probably using like a Prussian blue for a lot of that. And so, and we see that both in that spot of color there as well as on the flag. So they're both using that color as part of their organization. Although I would say that one of the differences in terms of that, right, is that here the blue and the red being part of what Madonna is wearing, right, and blue is traditionally associated with Madonna, is helping to, it's part of like the overall organization. It's kind of centered and it's kind of encompassing and controlling the other areas of emphasis inside this overall triangular area. Whereas the blue and red in the Delacroix painting is much more spots of color at points in the triangle that then lead us from one part of the triangle to the other, especially this one and that one. So that leads also to the issue of, in both of these, how did they create focus? And a point that I made in class about this was that in the Madonna, right? In this painting,